strategy you choose to take. Now that we've had some time of talking about what strategy you can take and what kind of persona you could be and the way that you should think about debate and prepare for critical debates, let's talk about how we strategize the criticism and how we often also engage in that discussion. I have this comic here because I don't know how much you all know about Wile E. Coyote, but he is probably the greatest strategy in the history of cartoons, but he is also the worst execution or the worst kind of implementer of those strategies. And I want you to be a great strategy person, but I also want you to be able to implement those strategies. So I want to give you kind of an outline or a blueprint of how you should implement those strategies based on the type of person you've identified yourself from the first part of this lecture. So when you're affirmative, there's a simple acronym you can use that allows you to make sure that you answer the critique fully. The acronym is POSTAL. You want to start with a discussion. Well, you don't want to start, but you want to make sure you have a conversation about the permutation. You want to make sure that you have theory arguments about why permutations are legitimate based on a flaw that happens with the critique, whether that's a vague alternative, excuse me, or whether it's utopian fiat, or whether it's some form of violation that they do, whether it's sandbagging or whatever else, depending on what their argument is. The second is you want offense. If they say that X thing is good, you want to be able to say that X thing is bad. Now, obviously, we don't read offense against kind of structural violence impacts. We will not say that racism is good. We will not say that sexism is good or anything of that nature. Offense comes from your ability to win link terms instead. So when they identify that a certain action, like passing a law, hurts more Black people than it does help them, you need to have specific evidence that contradicts that statement. 1 second, a sponsor break. Next is you need to have solvency deficit arguments. That one of the easiest ways to beat a criticism is to be able to point out why the criticism doesn't solve the issues that the affirmative has raised. One way you can do that is to be able to adequately explain why the theory of power that you're using, whether it is reform of the law because law controls society, or whether it is the releasing of certain bodies from prison because imprisonment is the problem, not the criminal justice system. You can describe why the alternative isn't able to rise to the level to do those things. And even if it is, it does it at a much slower pace, which means that preferring the alternative means that we still, preferring the affirmative means we still get access to all of the solvency arguments and we can avoid the kind of worrisome discussion that happens from the other perspective. Next, theory arguments need to exist writ large throughout the criticism. You need to challenge the fact that the alternative probably doesn't have excuse me, sorry about that. You need to challenge the fact that the alternative doesn't have a solvency mechanism. You need to make sure that you're making framework arguments that says that we need to have a clearly defined way of how we evaluate kind of the plan in a vacuum versus the alternative, which means that your vision of the world, which I'll talk about in a second, now becomes a bigger issue than the alternative or the criticisms that they've brought up, because you repositioned yourself as being the focal point of the debate. The alternative debate is where you get to spend time kind of attacking their best piece of offense. If they lose their alternative, presumption flips AF again, which means that all you have to do is win that their alternative doesn't resolve the links that they identify, and then you can make the secondary argument that if it doesn't resolve the links, there's only a risk that you resolve those links or that you outweigh those links and you therefore win the debate. The alternative debate is a place where you can make theoretical arguments. It's a place where you should prioritize offense, but also prioritize defense. It's also the place where you should be explaining what the permutation is. I'll say that one more time. The alternative is the place where you should be explaining what the alternative is. If you do not use the language of the negative team in explaining what the alternative is, you can't win the permutation. I'll say that one more time. If you do not use the language of the criticism or the language of the alternative in the permutation, you can't win a permutation. Chances are you don't understand what the alternative is, which is why your explanation of the permutation will always be perm do both and will always lose to links. That links are disads because you don't know how to re-explain the permutation in a way that captures the alternative. Finally is the link debate. Now listen, postal is an acronym that says these are all of the things you have to answer. Postal is not the order in which you should answer these things. It's just a checklist. So when I say finally the link debate, doesn't mean you have to wait to the end in order to get to the link debate. It simply means that these are all the things that you may have to make sure you answer. So in the link debate, obviously, one of the really useful things to do is again, use the permutation to test whether or not the links actually matter in the context of the affirmative. But the other thing is to test whether or not the links are talking about the status quo or whether the links are specific to the action of the plan. Most links will not be specific to the actual plan unless they are making analytic arguments. If they're reading evidence, unless it postdates yours and unless it says your author's name, it's probably not actually talking about what your case is talking about. It could be talking about an example of something that's like your case, but it's probably not your case specifically. So knowing that when reading through their evidence and understanding your case enough means that you're able to utilize, ready, the assumptions we said that are good in order to resolve problems that the links identify with the status quo. I'll say that part one more time. Once you understand your assumptions, you can utilize them to identify how what you do is good and avoids the links that they are talking about, which actually apply to the status quo. All right? Postal, remember it. It'll win you a lot of debate rounds because it'll help you better understand how to interact with your opponent. Finally, for the affirmative, I kind of want to just give you a performative checklist. This is something you should use when you're going and you're in a debate and you want to make sure that you're doing the most you can to beat the criticism. The first, as I said before for the permutation, is you have to use their language. When you're working on the link debate, on the impact debate, when you're making offensive arguments, when you're going for the permutation, when you're talking about the alternative, you have to be able to integrate the language of the criticism into the affirmative. If you do not integrate that language, you're probably not going to win the debate, because I guarantee you the negative will integrate the language of the affirmative in order to make their point. Second one is you have to maintain your order. So many debaters allow the other team to completely mix and match the order of how the debate is structured, which means that now, instead of the order following the 2AC, as it does traditionally, it now follows the block. And the 1AR responds to what the block says, instead of keeping the order of the 2AC, which is how you clearly point out when they've dropped arguments versus when they've answered arguments. Remember, it is to the benefit of the negative to make the debate messy, because the criticism operates better when we can get the judge to think about the world globally than we get them to think about it kind of in a microcosm or in very specific instances. The next part is specificity beats flair. Saying nuclear war 100 times will not win you the debate. Giving me a specific scenario of how the affirmative resolves conflict, which is undeniably going to happen, which results in nuclear war, is much better than just saying nuclear war. Specificity wins debates. Know your scenarios. Understand how your scenarios operate. Understand the assumptions of those scenarios, and then execute that explanation in a way that the negative cannot capture because they lack the historical or the kind of just the factual arguments about why your argument is incorrect because you framed it in that way. This does not mean you should lie about your advantages. It means you should know how to explain them enough so that the information you give boxes them out of their best offense. Specificity over flair. Next is you should assume the 1AR will have to shift to a brand new argument based on the block. If there is no 2AC shift and the 2AC maintains the same, we'll act like you do, but we all know the 2AC shifts according to the K. It's okay. The 1AR also has to shift at the same time. The 1AR has to be responsive to what the block has done. Generally, the block attempts to overcorrect based on the 2AC shift that happens, right? That's just the way debate operates now with the K. 1AC happens, 1NC happens. 2AC overcorrects, so the block overcorrects the overcorrection. 1AR is standing here like, I can extend the 1AC. That's not the role of the 1AR. Role of the 1AR at this point is to overcorrect the overcorrection of an overcorrection. And I know that's a lot of overcorrecting. But the purpose of the 1AR is to make sure that you have the arguments necessary and they apply. So specificity is really important for the 1AR. The more you know about your utility arguments, the easier it is for you to be able to execute them. Finally, is card check. Every single speech, you should say, I need these 3 to 4 cards, maybe 5 cards in the debate, and we need to know where they are and how they apply to certain arguments. That has to be done before the debate. It cannot be done in the debate. In the debate is where you simply execute that strategy. It's not the place where you deploy, where you figure out what that strategy is. So knowing which cards you need in the debate for certain debates is critical, and that is the fastest way to ensure that you kind of have your best offense available to you. And now it's all about how well you can weave together a story that is specific, uses their language, maintains your order, and responds to kind of the shifts they've made throughout the debate. Extend your cards, yeah. Oh, yeah, no, that's important, actually. I'm sorry. Card check is just more than just using yours. It's also that you need to respond to kind of the best offensive arguments they have by knowing what those arguments are and talking about them in the context of your arguments. And when I say talking about them, I listened to a couple of speeches today. Refutation of evidence is not that you admit that they read a piece of X evidence. Refutation is that you recognize the evidence they read and you answer the warrants to why that evidence is incorrect. Recognize, answer warrants. Now, strategizing the negative, I just kind of put it all out there. I don't think there's a massive difference when we talk about the criticism, other than the amount of time you get to spend on executing it. If you are a flex or an opportunist debater, most likely you are not spending a massive amount of time explaining kind of how the criticism works. And depending on how you debate, you also probably won't even split the criticism. The 2NC and the 1NR will be one kind of continual speech, which means that the best thing for you to do is to figure out quick ways to give an overview, which is inclusive of the impact debate, the alternative debate, and the framework debate, and give short descriptions. That's why description is in parentheses here. If it's a situation where you know for a fact that you might go for the K, I have seen people split the block and give the link work and the perm work to the 1NR. But generally speaking, if you're a flex and you have multiple off-case positions, you should not do that. You should give the 1NR one position to go for, because the 1NR is no cross-X for the 1NR, and they have a limited amount of prep to respond to the things the 1NR says, which means the 1NR can get away with a lot of spin in order to win you an additional argument. So the 2NC for a flex, the block split for the flex and opportunity style debate should pretty much be about you condensing down the criticism or just going for it the entire time, which is also an option. But condensing down is what you're kind of going for. Now, for the authentic advocator and for non-traditional debaters, it's a little bit different. Like I said, an authentic advocator loves their overview. I think your impact debate here should be global. You should start with making what your argument is, right? Start with what your impact is. Then you should go on to tell me how your impact implicates the affirmative's impact argument. And then you should move on to the alternative. Now, the alternative is more than just repeating whatever the phrase is. The alternative is abolition. That's not an alternative explanation. The alternative explanation would need to explain how the impacts that you've identified and the impacts that you've explained the justification for, the AF's impacts, are resolved through the action that the alternative creates, whether that's rethinking, whether that is a repositioning, whether that's a rewriting, or whether that is an absolute destruction of something. The alternative has to make that explanation. After which, you should shift gears to the framework debate. And I'm going to talk in detail about that after this particular slide. But the framework debate is now where you tell the judge how they should think about the debate, how they should think about the world, and why that is the most important way to think about it or consider it. Following that, you can have a roll of the ballot discussion, which operates in a plethora of ways. One of the most useful ways to have a roll of the ballot argument is to integrate not only the arguments you make, but additionally, the way that people make those arguments. So it's about the strategy, but also the performance of that strategy. And if people violate either the strategy portion or the way that they performed, e.g., they have kind of participated or used language that is problematic during their performance, that is a reason why they can lose the debate, and their ballot could be used as a way to justify them losing it. Then you have theory defense. Theory defense does not mean answering K's are bad or answering vague alts are bad. Theory defense is whatever the theoretical justification or theoretical foundation of your argument is, you have to be ready to defend it. If you're going to read queer theory, our anti-blackness, our settler colonialism, our capitalism, our biopower. You have to be prepared as the 2NC to answer those theoretical objections to you using that position to explain your theory of power. Now, I don't think I've given kind of a robust explanation of theory of power, so I'll do that here. Theory of power is how we say the world operates. So where does kind of oppression stem from based on who has power and who does not have power, or who has authority and who does not have authority? An example would be if we take, anti-blackness, for example, then non-black, right, bodies have power. It's on a scale of marginal to complete power, and complete power at the top of that scale would be the slave master. And then black bodies would be at the bottom of no power, right? The lack of power. So power operates by constituting the continual denigration of black people, or the oppression of black people. And that's how they maintain their power, through different kind of technologies of accumulation and extermination. Capitalism, power operates through the individuals that determine value, whether it's through economics or whether it's through other means, to people who do not get to determine it, or are people that are impoverished. So your theory of power, okay, your theory of power explains how the world operates. A theoretical defense of that requires you to have a very good understanding of what your author, or what kind of the school of thought that your criticism arises from, says. Finally, you have to have a theoretical justification for the alternative. You have to have a reason why this political project that you want to take on is useful and is meaningful and is better than the current political project that exists. I think this will be kind of explained a little bit better when I get to the framework debate, because I think the framework debate is where a lot of this goes down. Now, I think the difference between kind of the 2NC that takes everything or gives a little bit to the 1NR, and the flex and opportunist block versus the authentic advocator versus non-traditional block, is the 1NR here uses the link debate not as just a link debate, but as your case debate too. You don't have time, if you're reading a one-off criticism, to go to the case additionally to make arguments. Now, you can do that if you want to, because some judges like it. But your link arguments should be synthesized with the case. They should be specific about the scenarios that the case has presented. You should not be reading generic arguments about how the state is anti-black, or how the state is capitalist, or how the state is biopower. You should be going through their cards during the reading of the 2NC, well, actually after the 2AC, during 2AC cross-X, during prep, but the 2NC takes, during the 2NC, and during 2NC cross-X, you should be reading through the 1NC, the affirmative, pulling lines from the affirmative that you can explain as link arguments to the theory that you have presented. You've had your case debate, we just call it a link debate. The reason you do that is earlier, where I told the affirmative, it is about the language and the specificity of the language they use. The same thing applies to the negative. This is how we shift power from the affirmative, being able to win its specific scenarios, back to the negative by being able to explain how those specific scenarios are just repetitive strategies that have happened throughout all time that allows for kind of violence to constitute itself on certain bodies over and over and over again. Finally, the permutation debate that you have when the 1NR takes it needs to be a grand event. You need to have at least 2 to 3 specific disads that are not linked to any of the link arguments you have. You need to have blocks written to answer the theoretical arguments they're going to make that justifies permutations. And those blocks should not just be traditional defensive arguments for why permutations are bad. They should integrate the theory that you have read in the debate or presented in the debate for why their usage of theory, or for why kind of the assumptions of the theory that they make are problematic according to the theoretical argument that you all are presenting in the debate. If you're reading generic severance perms are bad argument, then you're not really in a place where you have a lot of offense built that can beat them. This does not mean that you should not make severance permutations or severance permutation bad arguments, but it does mean that your arguments need to kind of graduate to a different level of complication or complexity in order to make sure that you are getting a better kind of offensive argument about why the permutation should always in every instance be rejected. The performative checklist for the negative. First and foremost, recognize that history is your friend. If you know the topic is criminal justice reform, you should know every single time that we had a criminal justice reform before now. You should know what it did. What were the effects of it? What did they change? How did they change it? Has there ever been a historical example anywhere where prisoners has been released based on the fear of disease spread? If so, what was the result of that? Has there ever been an example of prisons completely being abolished? Has it worked? Has it failed? Where is that example? History is your friend as a negative because your job is to prove the unprovable. And the reason why they think it's unprovable is because they refuse to look beyond the history of the United States federal government. Because if they look hard enough at history, right, problems begin to appear. My grandfather, before he passed, used to always say, no matter who your family is, if your family has lived in America for a long time, if you shake your family tree, a slave will fall out. And that's an impactful way to think about why the affirmative doesn't want to address history and only wants to continue to look forward, but not backwards. Your job as a negative is to look backwards, to make sure that they deal with the weight of the decisions they make based on the fact that they've already made those decisions in the past and they have not worked. Additionally, code switching is key. Code switching is language that derived obviously from Black vernacular English, which says that Black people naturally have to know how to use several different forms of English in order to survive. There are several things that I would say in this particular lecture that I can't say because I'm in mixed company. You have to understand and navigate that the same way if you read your criticism. There are several identity groups that have subtext and sub-languages, sub-vernacular. That's not for everybody. But as a debater, code switching really means using the language of your argument, but also using the language of traditional policy debaters that are now judges. Sometimes we're lucky and we have people that love reading our particular position or love our school of thought that we're into. But for the most part, policy debate is still very much dominated by people that love the traditional form of the activity. If you cannot speak traditional policy debate, you will lose debate simply because of a lack of explanatory power. I had a team that I coached where we decided that we were going to structurally change the way the judges had to interact with us. We didn't read cards at all. All they did was make arguments, and this team qualified to the NDT as a first-round team, and all they read was ratchet politics. They created a glossary that they also emailed to judges. If you don't believe me, you can ask judges to judge them. The Liberty HS, Michael Harrington and Brianna Thomas. A glossary they would email to judges because judges would simply say at the end of the debate, wow, that is a great argument you're making. I just didn't understand that's what the argument was. So code switching is critical to your ability to be able to win debates. Next is, remember how I told the affirmative they want to keep their order? Well, welcome to the negative. We don't want you to keep your order, but we don't care about order. We're not here for order. The criticism is designed to disrupt order. It's not here to allow you to enjoy kind of the pleasantries of going through the motions of talking about how we stop nuclear war. It is meant to make you stop and realize that material violence is happening now on the ground, and we have to deal with that before we can deal with anything else. So when people say no justice, no peace, that's literally what it means. No peace means you don't get to go to work. You don't get to play your games. You don't get to participate in the things that you love doing because this needs to be addressed first. So disorder is the order. Next is don't be afraid to kind of use some righteous rage. It's persuasive to hear someone advocating for something they passionately believe in and that they're using to call out someone who made a mistake, who has a bad perspective of the world, or a flawed perspective of the world. We don't have to be mean, and righteous rage doesn't require you to be mean. Righteous rage requires you to be firm, it requires you to be sincere, and it requires you to be committed to the idea that you are presenting. Framework, and I think this is probably going to be something that I'm like way over my time here. So I think this is going to be something that we're going to spend several days talking about. And I expect that we will, because framework is a concept that is as interesting as the picture that you see on the screen, which is that framework is all about the vision that you have for debate. And it's about you trying to explain that vision to the judge. It's about how we take the vision of what we want debate to be, of how we want debate to interact, and tell the judge that that thing works. If you run a reader policy app and you want them to have policy responses, that's a vision. Your vision is that policy be policy is the most useful way for you to engage in political kind of discussion. If you want to read a planless app and only debate teams that also talk about kind of ways that we can be more political and engage in material change and structural change, that's a vision for debate. Your framework is that vision. So when you're thinking about what your strategy is, how you're going to orient yourself towards debate, you're already crafting a vision of what you think debate should be. You don't have to ask us what we think the best framework argument is, because you have it already. It's your vision. It's how you interact. It's the way that your personality directly influences the way that you want to have conversations about the things that you want to talk about. The last thing the framework does is it tells the judge why your vision is preferable over the other person's. It tells the judge why it's preferable. Now, there are interesting ways to think about this. One way that I often tell students is instead of thinking about debate as a simulation, think about debate as competing thought experiments. What does it mean? What are the questions we're asking when we say framework that we really want judges to think about? If all things are equal and they get to say that their thing happens on the app and we get to say that our thing happens on the negative, how does a judge reconcile that with what's more important? That's where framework becomes a debate now, because you have to present the parts of framework that justifies to the judge why your vision is more important than the other person's. Those parts don't always have to be education and fairness or any of that, or ground. It doesn't always have to be that. But ultimately, it does come down to that because we haven't figured out a different way to have that conversation that makes people feel comfortable, to be perfectly honest. And I'm sure in the next couple of years, we'll probably figure that out. But right now, we haven't. So questions you can ask when you have competing thought experiments. You can ask, well, who is better? Who does something that achieves the goal that I think we should get out of debate? If you just think that we should learn, do you learn more from having policy debates at high rates of speed that only talk about nuclear war impacts? Or do you learn more by having philosophical discussions? The component part, we kind of just talked about that. And then finally, we also talked about how to compare. So I'm going to give you an example. A lot of kind of side-by-side comparison of ways that we can think about framework. If you're affirmative, one of the very first things that people always run to is that simulation is something that is good and it's useful. Simulation allows us to kind of think through what our strategies are. It allows us to have conversations about the consequences of those strategies. And then it allows us to take action necessary to resolve overall bad consequences and get to mostly good things. Well, the negative, it's probably more about subject formation. It's not about what we do or how we think about what we do that leads to other things. This is about how the conversations we have directly inform the people we become. So what type of people do we become if we only simulate violence? What type of people do we become if we only simulate action? The negative would say that that subject formation is problematic because that subject formation doesn't require us to do anything. Whereas the affirmative would say, no, that simulation does, because we think about it. And the thinking process is what creates subject formation, whereas the negative would say the doing process does it. So now we have contestation. We have areas of disagreement where we can debate. The second one is scenario planning. Well, simulating things are good, but we have to know what things we need to simulate first, right? Maybe. Subject formation is good, but maybe we should stop doing some things in order to really look at how subject is actually formed. Again, areas where it's contestable and where we can have discussions that helps frame the conversation of which vision is preferable. Consequentialism versus pedagogy. We should only look at kind of the consequences that happens from our actions. Well, no, hold on. We should think about the way that we understand the world, the way we learn about the world, and the way that we teach. Utilitarianism, nah. Structural violence. Body count, nope. Material violence, systemic, everyday violence that happens, how do we stop that? No, we need to worry about body count. A nuclear war kills way more people, and it hurts statistically more Black people, or more minorities, and empowers people. I hear this argument all the time, and people are always like, you know, and this is just a tangent, but you're going to hang out with me for a second. But I think this is a conversation we should have about the nuclear war debate and debate in general, which is people are like, well, nuclear war hurts more minorities anyway because urban cities are the main ones that's targeted. But from a military strategic position, that doesn't make sense. Like, if we wanted to strike a country that has nuclear weapons, why would we strike massive population areas that doesn't prevent them from striking us back? Why wouldn't we aim at the infrastructure that would allow for a secondary strike? Right? Maybe I'm tripping, but it seems to me that Russia would target our nuclear launch facilities. They wouldn't target Baltimore or New York City or Chicago because we don't have nuclear launch facilities in those places. They would want to take out the ability for us to strike them back, even though we do have defense systems that might be able to shoot their missiles out of the air. You know, that's a whole different conversation, but a good chunk to think about. I'm sorry, sometimes I get distracted. The last thing is, the affirmative for framework always wants to say we should just play the game of debate, whereas the negative would clearly say debate is more than a game. These are areas of contestation that exist when you're thinking about what your vision of debate is, where you don't have to be able to win every one of these. You don't even have to make these apply to the areas I made them apply. You can mix and match. But you should at least come to a framework debate with at least 2 to 3 of these ready to discuss while they're more important than anything else the other team can say. So a good practice from this would be writing down the 5 things on the negative side and writing down the 5 things on the affirmative side, and then writing why simulation good answers everything on the negative side, or why subject formation answers everything on the affirmative side. And that's just a good practice, because then you're able to form what you think your vision of debate is, and framework becomes so much easier because you're able to take out the impact arguments that they have that say that their framework is good. A few key things to remember, and I'm going to get you out of here. I know we're way over, and I apologize. I most likely, by the time you've watched this, I have already broken it into 2 sections because it's way too long to be one. We're supposed to keep these presentations around 30 minutes, but I really like talking about the case, so I'm sorry. The first thing, few things to remember is that decay is always about a game of spin. No one is right without the right context. History matters, specificity matters, so make sure that you talk about that. Make sure that you tie any of the assumptions they have to specific historical context that grants credence to your argument of why certain results will always happen. Remember, the AF is generally built on saying X thing will work because we know it's worked in the past, unless we point out that it has not worked in the past. You should also start with a generic position in the 1NC. You can have 1 or 2 specific links if you want, but the specificity really begins to happen after the shift. Really begins to happen after the shift. Remember, the shift generally happens in the 2AC, where the 2AC will get up and say, they've done all these things that you've said are bad, that you've said is good, and they've avoided all the bad things that you've identified. But do they really? Do they? Maybe. I don't know. But you need to make sure to point that out. Finally, thank you for taking the time to watch this video. We have kind of talked about finding what your strategy is. We talked about preparing your strategy. We've talked about both AF and negative strategy. We spent a decent amount of time, I think, talking about framework and ways to think about how to form your vision, and also talk a little bit about how to further prepare for that discussion. Thank you so much for watching. Again, my name is Benjamin Hagwood, and this is for the SDI Lab and Camp, or Institute, excuse me. And I will be talking to you all soon. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Good night.